In the spring of 1951, the most powerful military commander in the world was fired by the most powerful civilian leader on Earth. Not on a battlefield, not after a defeat, but because of a letter, a demand, and a dangerous belief that one general's vision of war superseded the authority of an entire government. Douglas MacArthur, the five-star general of the Army, who had accepted Japan's formal surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945, who had waited ashore at Leyte Gulf with cameras rolling and history watching, believed that the war in Korea was not just a regional conflict. It was the opening act of a civilizational confrontation with Communist China, and he was prepared to fight it that way, with or without permission from Washington. The question that shook the foundations of American democracy was never really about military strategy. It was about something far older, far more dangerous, and far more consequential. Who, in a republic built on the principle of civilian control, gets to decide when and how a nation goes to war? The answer that Harry S. Truman gave, blunt, deliberate, and deeply unpopular, would define the relationship between American military power and democratic governance for generations to come. And it began not in 1951, but in the ruins of the world that ended in 1945. If this kind of history, raw, human, and consequential, is what you come here for, then right now is the moment to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves stories that go deeper than the headlines. And before this video ends, leave a comment telling us, did you know that MacArthur's firing was triggered not by a battlefield failure, but by a letter he sent directly to the enemy? That detail alone changes everything, and we're about to explain every word of it. When World War II ended in August 1945 with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th, followed by Japan's announcement of surrender on August 15th, the world inherited a new kind of order, one shaped by nuclear weapons, ideological rivalry, and exhausted empires. Douglas MacArthur stood at the center of that transformation. As supreme commander for the Allied powers, he oversaw the occupation of Japan with near absolute authority, rewriting the Japanese constitution, dismantling the imperial military structure, and modernizing an entire civilization according to his own sweeping, paternalistic, and undeniably effective vision. He was not merely a general in Tokyo. He was a proconsul, a ruler in all but name, governing 68 million people from the Daiichi building in central Tokyo with a discipline and confidence that bordered on messianic certainty. He had not set foot in the United States since 1937. He had fought campaigns from the Philippines to New Guinea to the shores of Japan itself. And by 1950, when North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel on June 25th in a dawn assault that caught the South Korean army almost entirely unprepared, MacArthur was the obvious and immediate choice to command the United Nations response. President Harry Truman, the Missouri haberdasher turned senator turned accidental president, who had authorized the use of atomic weapons against Japan without flinching, now found himself needing the one man whose ego was nearly as large as his reputation, a man who had already begun to believe that the limits placed on him were not strategic wisdom, but cowardice dressed up as policy. The early months of the Korean War were catastrophic. The North Korean People's Army, equipped with Soviet-supplied T-34 tanks and led by commanders hardened by years of fighting alongside Mao Zedong's forces in the Chinese Civil War, drove United Nations and South Korean forces into a desperate defensive perimeter around the port city of Pusan in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. By late July and August of 1950, it seemed entirely possible that the entire Korean peninsula would fall under communist control before a coherent defense could be organized. MacArthur, characteristically, responded not with caution but with audacity. On September 15, 1950, he launched Operation Chromite, an amphibious assault on the port of Incheon, a location that nearly every military planner in Washington had declared operationally suicidal due to its extreme tidal fluctuations and narrow approach channels. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had grave reservations. MacArthur brushed them aside. He was right, catastrophically, brilliantly, undeniably right. The Incheon landing was a masterpiece of operational planning. Within 2 weeks, United Nations forces had recaptured Seoul, cut North Korean supply lines, and transformed a near defeat into a stunning reversal of fortune. MacArthur's legend grew even larger. And it was precisely that legend, that unbroken conviction in his own infallibility, that would bring everything crashing down just 6 months later. Emboldened by Incheon, MacArthur and the Truman administration faced a critical decision. Halt at the 38th parallel, the original boundary between North and South Korea, or push north and attempt the complete destruction of the North Korean state. Truman, influenced by the National Security Council and by the general optimism of the moment, authorized the advance beyond the 38th parallel on September 27, 1950, with a crucial caveat. MacArthur was explicitly instructed that under no circumstances should he use non-Korean forces near the Chinese or Soviet borders, and that if Chinese or Soviet forces entered the conflict, he was to report back to Washington immediately for new orders rather than escalate unilaterally. MacArthur acknowledged these instructions, and then, with the confidence of a man who believed his own judgment superior to any committee in Washington, he proceeded to ignore the spirit of every single one of them. On October 15, 1950, Truman flew to Wake Island in the Pacific to meet MacArthur face to face, a meeting MacArthur considered an inconvenience and Truman considered a political necessity. When Truman asked whether Chinese intervention was likely, MacArthur famously replied that the chance was very slim, that if the Chinese tried to intervene, their forces would face the greatest slaughter in the history of warfare. 300,000 Chinese soldiers crossed the Yalu River on the night of October 19, 1950, and entered Korea in secret, and MacArthur never saw it coming. The Chinese intervention was the hinge point of the entire crisis. In late November 1950, at the Chosin Reservoir in northeastern Korea, United Nations forces, including the 1st Marine Division and elements of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Division, were encircled by 12 Chinese divisions in temperatures that plunged to minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The Battle of the Chosin Reservoir, fought between November 27th and December 13th, 1950, became one of the most brutal engagements in American military history, a nightmare of frozen ground, relentless assaults, and desperate breakouts that cost the United States and its allies thousands of casualties. MacArthur, who had assured Truman that the war would be over by Christmas, now faced a military catastrophe of his own making. His response was not reflection or restraint. It was escalation. He began publicly and privately demanding that the Truman administration authorize him to bomb Chinese bases north of the Yalu River inside Manchuria. He wanted to use nationalist Chinese forces from Taiwan, under Chiang Kai-shek, to open a second front against mainland China. He wanted, in effect, a completely different and far larger war, a war that Truman, the Joint Chiefs, and every Allied government from London to Paris to Ottawa feared would trigger a direct confrontation with the Soviet Union and potentially spark a Third World War. This was not a disagreement about tactics. It was a collision between two utterly incompatible visions of what America's role in the world should be. And one of those visions was held by a man who commanded armies, and the other was held by the man who commanded him. Now, precisely at the midpoint of this extraordinary story, subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. Like this video to help others find it. Share it with a friend who believes history is more dramatic than any fiction, and drop a comment below. Did you know that MacArthur actually sent a direct communication to the enemy that may have sabotaged a ceasefire negotiation Truman was secretly preparing? That single act may have been the final straw, and the details are even more remarkable than the summary. Throughout late 1950 and early 1951, the relationship between MacArthur and the Truman administration deteriorated from tension into open contempt. MacArthur made his displeasure with Washington's limited war strategy known not through official channels, but through interviews with journalists, letters to Republican congressmen, and public statements that contradicted official policy with barely concealed disdain. He gave an interview to U.S. News and World Report in which he blamed Washington's restrictions for the military situation in Korea. He communicated with House Republican Minority Leader Joseph Martin of Massachusetts, sharing his view that the real war with communism had to be fought in Asia, not Europe, a direct challenge to the Truman administration's Europe First strategy. And then, on March 24, 1951, he crossed a line that no American theater commander had ever crossed before. Truman had been quietly preparing a diplomatic initiative, a carefully worded proposal for a ceasefire and negotiations that had been coordinated with America's allies. Before Truman could deliver this proposal, MacArthur issued his own ultimatum directly to the Chinese military command, threatening to expand the war unless China's commanders came to the negotiating table on his terms. It was not a battlefield communiqué. It was a unilateral act of foreign policy by a uniformed officer, a direct usurpation of the president's constitutional authority as commander-in-chief. Truman later wrote in his memoirs that MacArthur's statement left him with no choice but to act, because if he allowed that communication to stand unanswered and unpunished, the constitutional principle of civilian control over the military would be destroyed, perhaps permanently. The Martin Letter, which became public on April 5, 1951, was the final document in a case that had been building for months. Congressman Joseph Martin read MacArthur's letter aloud on the floor of the House of Representatives, and its contents, in which MacArthur criticized the Europe First strategy and declared that in war there was no substitute for victory, created a firestorm in Washington. Truman convened meetings with his senior advisors, including Secretary of State Dean Acheson, Secretary of Defense George C. Marshall, himself a five-star general and the architect of the Marshall Plan, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, chaired by General Omar Bradley. Every one of them, reluctantly or not, concluded that MacArthur had to be relieved of command. The decision was not impulsive. It was the product of months of frustration, of violated instructions, of public insubordination, and of that one extraordinary act of diplomatic sabotage in March. On April 11, 1951, at 1 o'clock in the morning Washington time, the White House released the announcement before MacArthur could receive formal notification, an operational failure that wounded MacArthur's pride as deeply as any military defeat. He learned he had been fired not from an official messenger, but from a news broadcast intercepted by his staff in Tokyo. General Matthew Ridgway, who had rebuilt the shattered Eighth Army after its disastrous retreat in late 1950 and had stabilized the front near the 38th parallel through brilliant and grinding combat leadership, was named as MacArthur's replacement. MacArthur returned to the United States on April 19, 1951, for the first time in 14 years, to a reception that defied political categorization. In San Francisco, in Washington, in New York City, crowds of hundreds of thousands lined the streets. Ticker tape fell over Lower Manhattan in a parade that rivaled the celebrations of 1945. On April 19th, before a joint session of Congress, MacArthur delivered what became one of the most famous speeches in American political history, his farewell address, in which he defended his strategy, attacked the concept of limited war, and concluded with the line that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. The emotional impact was enormous. Republican senators spoke of impeaching Truman. Polls showed the president's approval ratings in the low 20s. And yet, the subsequent Senate hearings on MacArthur's dismissal, which ran through May and June of 1951, told a very different story. General Omar Bradley, testifying before the Senate Armed Services Committee, delivered a verdict that cut through the sentiment and the spectacle, that MacArthur's proposed strategy would have involved the United States in the wrong war, at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and with the wrong enemy. Secretary Marshall testified to MacArthur's repeated insubordination. The Joint Chiefs, one by one, confirmed that they had supported Truman's decision. The emotional tide that had swept Washington in April slowly receded, and the constitutional principle that Truman had defended, at enormous political cost, was upheld by the weight of evidence, testimony, and democratic deliberation. The Korean War continued for 2 more years after MacArthur's dismissal, grinding on in a stalemate of artillery duels, trench warfare, and grinding attrition near the 38th parallel, until an armistice was finally signed at Panmunjom on July 27, 1953, a ceasefire that MacArthur had considered an unacceptable capitulation. Harry Truman chose not to run for re-election in 1952, leaving office in January 1953 with one of the lowest approval ratings of any modern president. History, however, has been considerably kinder to him than the polls of his own time. The principle he defended, that in a democracy, elected civilian leaders, not uniformed commanders, hold the ultimate authority over the use of military force, is not merely a procedural rule. It is the structural guarantee that distinguishes a republic from a military dictatorship, and Truman paid a steep personal and political price to defend it at the moment it mattered most. Douglas MacArthur, for his part, never held another command. He lived in retirement at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City, consulted occasionally, and died on April 5, 1964, 13 years to the day after the Martin letter was read on the floor of Congress. He was 84 years old. The war he wanted was never fought. The war that was fought ended in a draw that 70 years later still defines one of the most dangerous borders on Earth. And the question MacArthur forced America to answer, about the limits of military authority, about the meaning of victory, about who decides when a nation goes to war, has never stopped being asked, because the tension between power and accountability is not a historical artifact. It is the permanent condition of every democracy that has ever tried to remain one. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you didn't know, subscribe to this channel right now. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to understand why civilian control of the military is not a bureaucratic formality, but a matter of survival for democratic society. And leave a comment below telling us, what surprised you most, MacArthur's letter to the enemy, Truman's political courage, or the fact that the man who fired the most celebrated general in America left office more unpopular than the man he fired?